The largest and deadliest concentration camp of the Third Reich was Auschwitz. It was a huge complex in which over 1 million people were imprisoned. The crimes of the camp were endless, and still today are being uncovered, and the guards of Auschwitz were known for their immense brutality. Of the thousands of SS guards that worked there, only a very small number would ever be brought to justice, and the former commandant Rudolf Höss would later be executed on a specially built gallows inside the camp he once oversaw. But amongst the guard staff were a number of women, or Aufsehrein, who exhibited such brutality and evil at Auschwitz, and they went on to work at other sites too. A number of women were executed at the end of the war for their work at Auschwitz, and their antics there condemned thousands of women to death inside of the gas chambers. Join us today as we look at the evil female guards of Auschwitz, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. As Auschwitz grew to become a huge and colossal complex, 1.3 million people were sent there. This included hundreds of thousands of women and children who would suffer greatly. Once the prisoners arrived at Auschwitz, selections would take place, in which the SS guards would send people to their deaths. Women and children often suffered greater, as they had less chance of being admitted into the camp, as they were not considered as able to conduct backbreaking work as the men were. Because of this, thousands of women were sent to their deaths, with their children as soon as they arrived at Auschwitz, and many of these were selected by the female guards. The Aufsehrein were a collection of around 5,000 women that worked at the concentration camps, and in 1942 the first female guards arrived at Auschwitz. They often trained at Ravensbrück, which was an all-female camp, and they learned under brutal women such as Maria Mandel, who would be executed at the end of the war. As mass deportations continued, there was a need to send female guards to Auschwitz, as the female camp was filling up. It's believed that around 200 women worked there, and there were some of the most sadistic guards. A number of these were in cahoots with the SS male guards, and would be known for their sadism. Around 30% of the registered inmates of Auschwitz were women, and the first mass transport from Ravensbrück consisted of 999 non-Jewish German women. These women were classed as criminals and political prisoners, and were considered the founders of the women camp. But along with the other women from Ravensbrück came a large number of female guards. The Commandant Rudolf Höss wrote, "It was easy to predict that these beasts would mistreat the women over whom they exercised power. Spiritual suffering was completely alien to them." That same day another 1,000 women arrived from Slovakia, and this transport was led by Adolf Eichmann, and over the next few days more women arrived there. They were held in blocks 1 to 10 at Auschwitz I, but then from the 6th of August 1942, 13,000 women were transferred to a new women's camp in Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the main extermination site. One inmate wrote of the shame and humiliation of their arrival at the camp. She said, "They told us to get undressed and they shaved us. They shaved my beautiful blonde hair and my two sisters' hair, and we were standing naked before the soldiers, and for me it was a shock because I was a religious girl. I never was undressed in front of a man, and they made all kinds of dirty jokes about our bodies, and they looked at us and I was standing there shivering, naked, and I was exposed. I felt like an animal, and the way they treated us was so terrible." The women's camp had 15 brick and 15 wooden barracks, and it was later extended, but the conditions at the women's camp was horrific. They were often considered worse than a male prison, and one former inmate of the women's camp said, "There was one latrine for 30 to 32,000 women, and we were permitted to use it at certain hours of the day. We stood in line to get to this tiny building, knee-deep in human excrement. As we all suffered from dysentery, we could barely wait our turn, and soiled our ragged clothes, which never came off our bodies, thus adding to the horror of our existence by the terrible smell that surrounded us like a cloud. The latrine consisted of a deep ditch, with planks thrown across it at certain intervals. We squatted on those planks like birds, perched on a telegraph wire, so close that we could not help soiling one another." For the women prisoners of Auschwitz, the day would begin earlier than the men, when the female block leaders would sound a gong and would then drive the prisoners from their beds with sticks to make them wash and use the toilet quickly. The sanitation of the camp was shocking, and there were very few latrines and a lack of water, and each wash house had to serve thousands of inmates. They were forced to work very hard, and if they could not, then they were shot. A number of women were also sent for medical experiments inside of Block 10 at Auschwitz I, under the gaze of evil doctors such as Josef Mengele. But who were the guards who worked there and staffed the female camps? One of the most infamous female guards of Auschwitz was Johanna Bormann, a woman who became known as a weasel, or the woman with the dogs. She was a brute who would patrol Auschwitz with her large dogs, and she would then encourage these animals to attack and maim prisoners. These animals did kill the women, and Bormann was later executed for her crimes. Who it's believed was responsible for the deaths of over 500,000 prisoners. Mandel was known as a beast, and she took part in selections of prisoners who were sent to the gas chambers. Even if a prisoner looked at her, she would then send them straight to their deaths, or they were executed straight away on sight. She also signed inmate lists and signed off on those people who were killed inside the gas chambers. One inmate said of her evil that, during these selections, defendant Mandel tortured the prisoners in a cruel way, beating the women, the men and the children with a whip and kicking them blindly. She would tear the children from the arms of their mothers, and when the mothers tried to come near the children and defend them, Maria would beat the mothers horribly and kick them. I saw right next to me a young 20-year-old mother who tried to go near her 2-year-old child, thrown onto the car, and Mandel kicked and beat her so cruelly that she did not get up any more. I held my 4-year-old child by the hand. The defendant Mandel approached me, tore my child away from me and threw my child onto a still empty car so that the child got wounded in the face and began to cry and call me. But I was put aside to the group that wasn't loaded on the cars. When I tried to reach a child crying on the car, Mandel began to beat me so cruelly that I fell. Mandel continued to kick me, although I was lying on the ground, and she knocked out almost all of my teeth with her shoe. Another inmate continued with the descriptions of her evil treatment, and they said, "In my block, Block 15, 700 women were chosen out of 1,000. In the whole camp, that is, in Lager A, where we stayed in the so-called quarantine, Mandel selected several thousands of women, and all of them naked were crammed into one block, number 25, where they stayed for 7 days and nights without food and water. On the night of the 27th of September, they were transported to the crematorium. For a period of these 7 days, we heard horrible screams and groans issuing from that block, and when the women were taken to the crematoria, the block elder, a Slovakian woman named Sila, who had already been tried in Czechoslovakia, told us that after those 7 days there were more corpses than living people in that block, and almost all of them had bitten fingers and breasts and plucked out eyes. During these 7 days, if any prisoner wanted to carry water or some food to that block, she was arrested there and perished along with the rest. The above described selection was carried out by defendant Mandel in person, with the help of Karpo, Stenya, Leo and Maria, all of them cruel and used to torturing the prisoners in a horrible manner. Irma Grese was considered the beautiful beast or the hyena of Auschwitz. She was a young woman who at the age of 22 would go to her execution inside Hamlin prison. She became the youngest woman to die in the 20th century under British law, but she was known for being an evil young woman who would sadistically murder and kill. She would guard the women and men with her pistol, and she would shoot at them indiscriminately whilst holding her large dog. She also took part in the selections for the inmates of Auschwitz who went to the gas chambers. Elisabeth Volkenrath was just also 26 when she went to her death and execution, and despite her age she was rather senior at Auschwitz, and she would send many people in the selections to their deaths. She was promoted and she was considered one of the most senior women of the concentration camp system, and she oversaw all of the women at Auschwitz. Margot Drescher was also rather senior, and she was the head of all the camp officers in Auschwitz. One prisoner stated of her appearance, camp leader Drescher was there, her buck teeth sticking out, even when her mouth is closed. Other inmates described her ugly looks, and they testified about her beatings. She would disguise herself as a doctor wearing a white coat and gloves and carry out selections. It was said of her crimes, once Mrs. Drescher came, with her huge bloodhound, undressed everybody, took away even our shoes, and we had to stand for hours completely naked. None of us were thinking of life anymore. The gas chambers seemed unavoidable. There were many more women who worked at Auschwitz and became notorious for their evil, but most of those who were executed at the end of the war were women who had actively taken part in the selections, and they would have been the ones who condemned others to death. It was this that was the nail in the coffin for these women. For example, Elizabeth Lutker beat women and children and condemned many, which was later, 3 years after the war had come to an end, condemned to death. But there were dozens more who were never brought to justice for their crimes of Auschwitz. Many women never saw the inside of a courtroom for their evil crimes at the camp, and their stories and activities inside the largest concentration camp went with them to the grave. As the camp was being liberated, many women fled, and also many saw themselves transferred to other concentration camps. For example, Grese, Bormann and Volkenrath would end up at Bergen-Belsen, and for them, before the hangman got them, their justice was to also help clean up the evils of the camp. But the horrific truth of the female guards of Auschwitz is that many of them sent prisoners to their deaths each day without a care, and they were complicit in the executions and murders of over 1 million people. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.